Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We are a repository of stories, a quiet space where the echoes of the past are given voice once more. Tonight we ascend into the thin, cold air where the rules of the world below cease to apply. We explore the ultimate high-stakes gamble played out at 30,000 feet, the Hijacker's Gambit. It's a terrifying moment when a commercial flight, a symbol of human progress and connection, becomes a prison in the sky, a floating pawn in a deadly game of political chess, greed, or fanaticism. Our journey begins not with one, but with a series of chilling tales of terror in the skies. Case 1. The hijacking of TWA Flight 847. The air in Athens on the morning of June 14, 1985, was thick with the promise of a Mediterranean summer. At Hellenic International Airport, passengers for Trans World Airlines Flight 847 were making their way onto the Boeing 727. It was a routine flight, a milk run as pilots called it, hopping from Cairo to Athens, then to Rome, onward to Boston, and finally terminating in Los Angeles. The 139 passengers and 8 crew members were a mosaic of humanity: American tourists eager for a European vacation, families returning home, Greek nationals, and a small contingent of U.S. military personnel. There was a sense of benign anonymity to the crowd, the kind of transient community that forms and dissolves with every takeoff and landing. In the cockpit, Captain John Testrake, a veteran pilot with a placid demeanor and a deep, reassuring voice, went through his pre-flight checks. Alongside him were First Officer Philip Maresca and Flight Engineer Christian Zimmerman. In the cabin, the flight attendants, led by the remarkably composed and resourceful Uli Derrickson, prepared for departure. The safety demonstration was performed, the seatbelt signs illuminated, and with a gentle push, the aircraft taxied onto the runway. At 10:10 a.m., TWA 847 lifted gracefully into the clear blue sky, its silver fuselage glinting in the sun. The Greek coastline, a jagged line of white and green, receded below. For the first hour, everything was as it should be. The drink cart made its gentle, rattling journey down the aisle. Conversations buzzed at a low hum. The world was orderly, predictable. This illusion of order was about to be systematically and brutally dismantled. Shortly after the plane leveled off over the Ionian Sea, 2 men who had boarded in Athens rose from their seats. They had seemed unremarkable, just 2 more faces in the crowd. Now, their movements were sharp, deliberate, and filled with a menacing purpose. One, later identified as Muhammad Ali Hamadeh, brandished a 9mm pistol. His accomplice held 2 grenades, the pins secured by his thumbs, a constant, visible threat of instant obliteration. Their shouts, in heavily accented English and Arabic, sliced through the cabin's calm. Hijack! Hijack! Panic, sharp and electric, shot through the passengers. It was a primal, collective gasp, followed by a sudden, deathly silence. The men stormed the aisle, their eyes scanning the faces of the passengers, searching for something or someone. One of them kicked open the cockpit door, a flimsy barrier against such determined violence. Captain Testrake and his crew turned to see the muzzle of a gun. The world of checklists and flight paths had vanished. Their new reality was dictated by the demands of the men who now controlled their vessel and the lives of everyone on board. The hijackers were members of Hezbollah, the Party of God, a Shia Islamist militant group. Their demands were political, broadcast over the radio by a shaken Captain Testrake. They wanted the release of 766 Shia Muslims, mostly Lebanese, held in Israeli prisons. They also demanded international condemnation of Israel and the United States. Flight 847 was not their target, it was their leverage. The passengers were not people, they were currency. The first destination of this terrifying new itinerary was Beirut, Lebanon. The control tower at Beirut International Airport initially refused landing permission. The runway was blocked. Captain Testrake, with a hijacker's gun pressed to his neck, made a desperate plea over the radio. He has pulled the pin on a hand grenade, Testrake's voice crackled, laced with a tension that was terrifyingly real. He is ready to blow up the aircraft if he has to. We must land at Beirut. The authorities relented. The 727 descended into a city that was itself a synonym for chaos and conflict. On the blistering tarmac in Beirut, the first chapter of the ordeal unfolded. The hijackers, their faces now covered, demanded fuel. To show they were serious, they began to sift through the passengers' passports, a chilling audit of nationality. They were looking for Americans, specifically those with military identification. A U.S. Navy diver, a 23-year-old steelworker from Suffolk, Virginia, named Robert Stetham, was among them. He and 5 other divers were returning from an assignment in Greece. They were young, strong, and trained to be resilient. But resilience was no defense against this kind of calculated brutality. The hijackers identified Stetham and his colleagues. They were separated from the other passengers and viciously beaten. The sounds of the assault, the sickening thuds and muffled cries, echoed through the silent, terrified cabin. Stetham, in particular, was singled out. He absorbed the punishment with a stoicism that seemed only to infuriate his captors more. He refused to cry out to give them the satisfaction of his pain. It was during this first stop in Beirut that the hijackers' number swelled. A dozen more heavily armed men boarded the plane, reinforcing their control. They allowed the release of 19 passengers, mostly women and children, in exchange for fuel. Then, with its tanks full, the aircraft was ordered back into the air. The destination, Algiers, the capital of Algeria. The flight to Algiers was a descent into a new kind of hell. The air inside the cabin grew stale and hot. The smell of fear was palpable. In Algiers, another 20 passengers were released during a 5-hour stop. But the core group of American men remained. The negotiations were a tangled web of international diplomacy, with governments in Washington, Algiers, and Beirut scrambling for a solution. The hijackers' demands were unwavering. The Gambit was in full play. And then the plane was ordered back to Beirut. It was a cruel, exhausting shuttle diplomacy played out with human lives. As TWA 847 landed in Beirut for the second time, the hijackers' patience had worn thin. They felt the world was not taking them seriously enough. They decided they needed to make a statement, one written in blood. They dragged Robert Stetham to the open door of the aircraft. He had been beaten so severely he could barely stand. They executed him with a single shot to the head. His body was then unceremoniously dumped from the cabin onto the tarmac below, a stark and brutal message to the negotiators and the world watching in horror. Inside the plane, one of the hijackers turned to the remaining passengers, his voice cold. "You see? This is what we do to Americans." The murder of Robert Stetham was a turning point. It extinguished the last vestiges of hope for a swift, peaceful resolution. It demonstrated the hijackers' absolute ruthlessness. For the remaining hostages, the message was clear: any one of them could be next. The architect of much of the quiet resistance inside the aircraft was Uli Derrickson, the German flight attendant. She became a crucial intermediary. Because she spoke German, she was able to communicate with one of the hijackers, Hamadeh, whose English was poor. She was calm yet firm. She translated demands, relayed messages, and, in countless small ways, tried to protect her passengers. She used the TWA credit card to pay for the fuel in Algiers when the ground crew demanded payment, a surreal moment of commercial transaction in the midst of a terror crisis. She soothed the hijackers when they became agitated, and she shielded passengers from their wrath. At one point, when a hijacker held his pistol to her head and threatened her, she began to sing a lullaby, an act of such unexpected humanity that it seemed to momentarily disarm him. Her courage was a small but steady light in the suffocating darkness of the cabin. After Stethem's murder, the dynamic of the crisis shifted. The majority of the passengers were removed from the plane and taken to a makeshift prison somewhere in the Shia-dominated suburbs of Beirut. The aircraft, which had been their collective prison, was now empty, save for the flight crew and a few remaining hostages who were held separately. Captain Testrake was forced to give press conferences from the cockpit, a weary puppet for his captors, relaying their propaganda to the global media. For the nearly 40 American men held hostage in the city, the next 2 weeks were a grueling ordeal of uncertainty and fear. They were moved from location to location, kept in squalid basements and unfinished buildings. They were fed sporadically, interrogated, and constantly threatened. They knew of Stethem's fate and lived with the chilling knowledge that the same could happen to them at any moment. They were pawns in a complex geopolitical game they could not comprehend, their freedom contingent on back-channel negotiations and the shifting whims of their captors. The world outside was in an uproar. The Reagan administration was under immense pressure to act. The memory of the Iran hostage crisis was still fresh, and the specter of another prolonged, humiliating standoff loomed large. Military options were considered, but the dispersal of the hostages throughout the labyrinthine streets of Beirut made a rescue operation like the one at Entebbe virtually impossible. Any attempt would likely result in a massacre. The path to resolution was through negotiation, brokered primarily by Nabi Berri, the leader of the Amal militia, a rival but sometimes cooperating Shia faction in Lebanon. It was a delicate dance. Israel, under pressure from the United States, eventually agreed to release a number of the Shia prisoners it held while publicly insisting it was not caving to terrorist demands. It was a concession masked as a pre-planned release. Finally, after 17 days of terror, the Gambit reached its conclusion. On June 30th, the remaining 39 hostages were driven in a convoy to the Syrian border and handed over to international authorities. They were flown to a U.S. airbase in West Germany, where they were greeted with tears, relief, and the overwhelming embrace of freedom. They were gaunt, exhausted, but alive. The aftermath was complex and far-reaching. The hijackers, for the most part, escaped immediate justice, melting back into the shadows of Beirut's war-torn landscape. Muhammad Ali Hamadeh was arrested 2 years later in Frankfurt, West Germany, while attempting to smuggle liquid explosives. Despite U.S. demands for his extradition for the murder of Robert Stetham, he was tried in Germany and sentenced to life in prison. In a controversial decision, he was paroled and released in 2005, disappearing once again. His accomplice and the other men who joined the hijacking in Beirut were never brought to justice. For the survivors, the ordeal never truly ended. It lived on in nightmares, in a lingering fear of flying, in the psychological scars that time could not fully heal. The story of TWA Flight 847 became a defining moment of 1980s terrorism, a brutal illustration of how a commercial airliner could be turned into a weapon of political warfare. It was a harrowing 17-day saga of fear, courage, and loss played out on the world stage. It underscored the vulnerability of the skies and the chilling calculus of those who would trade human lives for political ends. The memory of Robert Stetham, the young Navy diver who became a symbol of defiance in the face of barbarism, was a permanent, painful reminder of the ultimate cost of the hijacker's gambit. The terror that unfolded on that flight was a prelude to an era where the sky itself would become a front line in a new kind of war. But not all hijackings are born of political fanaticism. Some are born of something far simpler and perhaps far more enigmatic: greed. Our next case takes us from the politically charged battlegrounds of the Middle East to the cold, rain-swept skies of the Pacific Northwest, where a man in a business suit with a calm demeanor and a briefcase staged one of the most audacious and mysterious heists in history. He didn't seek to change the world, he sought only to vanish from it with a fortune in hand. His name, or the name he gave, was Dan Cooper. Case 2, the D.B. Cooper Skyjacking. The date was November 24th, 1971. Thanksgiving Eve. Across America, families were gathering, the air filled with the scent of roasting turkey and the warmth of homecoming. But in the Pacific Northwest, the sky was a sheet of cold, slate gray, weeping a persistent, chilling rain. At Portland International Airport, the passengers of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 shuffled aboard a Boeing 727-100, their minds on the short hop to Seattle and the holiday festivities that awaited them. Among them was a man who would, in a few short hours, cease to be a man and become a legend. He was in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, with a quiet, unremarkable presence. He wore a black business suit, a crisp white shirt, a narrow black tie secured with a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and a dark raincoat. He purchased his one-way ticket under the name Dan Cooper. He moved with a lack of haste that bordered on nonchalance, a man with no particular place to be, blending seamlessly into the transient anonymity of air travel. He took his seat, 18C, in the rear of the aircraft. He lit a Raleigh cigarette and, as the plane ascended into the turbulent, rain-lashed sky, he ordered a bourbon and soda from a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. He paid for his drink. Everything was perfectly, terrifyingly normal. The flight was less than half full, with 36 passengers and a crew of 6. The mood was relaxed, almost sleepy. The drone of the engines was a familiar, lulling sound. Shortly after takeoff, as the plane climbed towards its cruising altitude, Cooper calmly gestured for Schaffner to come to his seat. "Miss," he said, his voice low and without inflection, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner, accustomed to lonely businessmen passing her their phone numbers, initially dismissed it. She slipped the folded piece of paper into her purse, intending to read it later. "No, miss," Cooper insisted, his voice still placid, but now with an undeniable edge of command. "You should look at it now." Florence Schaffner paused. Something in his tone, a complete lack of agitation, made her stop. She retrieved the note and unfolded it. The words, written in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen, were chillingly direct. They stated that he had a bomb in his briefcase and that he wanted her to sit beside him. Schaffner did as she was told, a cold dread seeping into her veins. She sat down, her mind racing. Cooper, sensing her disbelief, leaned toward her and partially unzipped his briefcase. Just for a moment. Inside, she saw a chaotic nest of wires, a large cylindrical battery, and 8 red sticks that looked exactly like dynamite. There was no theatricality, no grand reveal. It was a simple, factual statement. He closed the briefcase. The quiet authority with which he did so was more frightening than any shouted threat. He then dictated his demands. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary civilian-issue parachutes, and 2 reserve chutes. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by at the Seattle-Tacoma airport to refuel the plane upon arrival. All of this was to be delivered in Seattle. If his demands were not met, he would blow up the aircraft. Schaffner took the note to the cockpit. She relayed the message to the pilot, Captain William Scott. Scott, a veteran of the skies, immediately contacted Northwest Orient's Operations Center in Minneapolis, who in turn alerted the FBI and Seattle-Tacoma Air Traffic Control. The Gambit had been declared. On the ground, a frantic, high-stakes operation swung into motion. The FBI scrambled to gather the money, photographing each of the 10,000 $20 bills. They sourced the parachutes from a local skydiving school. Meanwhile, in the air, Flight 305 became a ghost ship. To avoid alarming the other passengers, Captain Scott announced that they were experiencing a minor mechanical issue that required them to circle until it was resolved. For 2 long, agonizing hours, the 727 flew in a holding pattern over Puget Sound. The lights of Seattle glittered below, a world away. Inside the cabin, Dan Cooper remained a picture of composure. He smoked cigarette after cigarette. He ordered a second bourbon and soda, calmly insisted on paying for it, and even tried to give the flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, the change. He was polite, considerate, almost a gentleman. He pointed out the city of Tacoma as they flew over it. His demeanor was so profoundly at odds with the terror of his actions that it created a surreal, dreamlike atmosphere. The other passengers remained oblivious, some growing irritable at the delay, none aware that their lives were being negotiated for, dollar by dollar, minute by minute, in the cold air above them. At 5:39 p.m., the plane finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. It was taxied to a remote, brightly lit section of the tarmac, far from the main terminals. The rain was still falling, streaking the windows, distorting the flashing lights of the police and FBI vehicles that had surrounded the aircraft. Cooper ordered all the window shades to be pulled down, plunging the cabin into an artificial twilight, isolating them from the world outside. An airline employee, his silhouette stark against the floodlights, walked across the wet tarmac carrying a canvas bank bag filled with the cash and the parachutes. He delivered them to Tina Mucklow through the 727's aft air stair, the retractable staircase at the rear of the plane, a feature unique to this model of aircraft. Once the items were aboard, Cooper inspected them. He showed no emotion. He then, as promised, released all 36 passengers and flight attendant Florence Schaffner. As they disembarked, stepping from the tense silence of the plane into the rainy night, they had no idea of the true drama that had just unfolded. They were simply relieved that the mechanical issue was over and they could get on with their holiday. But the ordeal was not over. It had merely entered its second, more mysterious act. Cooper kept the flight crew, Captain Scott, First Officer Bob Radizak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and Tina Mucklow. He now outlined his final plan. He wanted them to fly to Mexico City. But he gave a set of very specific, very peculiar flight instructions. They were to fly at a low altitude, under 10,000 feet a height where the cabin could remain unpressurized. Their airspeed was to be kept below 150 knots, unusually slow for a jetliner. The landing gear was to remain down and the wing flaps were to be set at a 15-degree angle. To a layman, these instructions might seem random. To the pilots in the cockpit, they were a blaring alarm. This was a flight configuration that minimized the aircraft's speed and stability, making it difficult to fly, but perfect for one thing: a low-altitude, low-speed parachute jump. And crucially, it was a configuration that allowed the aft air stair to be opened in mid-flight without causing catastrophic structural failure. Dan Cooper knew exactly what he was doing. He had a deep, practical knowledge of the Boeing 727's capabilities. The pilots argued that the range to Mexico City was impossible under these conditions without refueling. Cooper, ever the pragmatist, agreed to a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. As the plane was being refueled, a process that took nearly 2 hours, Cooper and the remaining crew waited in the silent cabin. He had a brief, strange conversation with Tina Mucklow, who had become his primary point of contact. She found him not to be cruel, but quiet and intense. He was a man focused entirely on the task at hand. At approximately 7:40 p.m., TWA Flight 305 took off from Seattle for the second time that night, climbing slowly back into the darkness. The cabin was now a solitary, lonely space. Cooper instructed Tina Mucklow to show him how to operate the aft air stair. He then ordered her, along with the rest of the crew, to go into the cockpit and not come out. He told her to close the door behind her. As she did, she took one last look at him. He was methodically tying something, possibly the money bag, around his waist. He was alone in the passenger cabin, surrounded by empty seats, with $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He was a ghost in the machine. The crew sat in the cockpit, sealed off, flying blind into what they knew was coming. The plane bucked and shuddered in the turbulent weather. They flew south, through a storm, into the black, unlit wilderness of southwestern Washington. At approximately 8 p.m., the pilots noticed a sudden upward movement of the aircraft's tail section, accompanied by a subjective feeling of a pressure change in the cabin. A moment later, at 8:13 p.m., a warning light illuminated on the instrument panel. It indicated that the aft air stair, the ventral staircase at the back of the plane, had been lowered. Dan Cooper had opened the door. At 10,000 feet, in the freezing, rain-swept darkness, somewhere over the dense, rugged forests of the Cascade Mountains, the man known as Dan Cooper stepped out of a Boeing 727 and into oblivion. With a fortune strapped to his body, he plunged into the night, into the heart of a wilderness so vast and unforgiving that it swallows secrets whole. The plane continued on its course. At around 10:15 p.m., it landed safely at Reno Tahoe International Airport. The pilots had no idea if Cooper was still on board. Law enforcement, including FBI agents and local police, swarmed the aircraft, guns drawn, expecting a confrontation. They found nothing. The cabin was empty. The money was gone. 2 of the parachutes, 1 primary and 1 reserve, were gone. All that remained of Dan Cooper were a few cigarette butts, the black clip-on tie he had worn, and the mother-of-pearl tie clip. He had vanished as completely as a phantom. What followed was one of the most extensive and expensive manhunts in American history, codenamed Norjack for Northwest Hijacking. For months and then years, the FBI, aided by the U.S. Army, combed the projected jump zone. They searched the dense forests, the treacherous mountains, and the frigid rivers of Washington and Oregon. They used helicopters, ground troops, even a submarine to search Lake Merwin. They found nothing. No body. No parachute. No money. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him. The mystery of D.B. Cooper, a name born from an early journalistic error that stuck, became an American obsession. Who was he? Was he an experienced paratrooper? A disgruntled veteran with knowledge of demolitions and aircraft? Or was he an amateur who had simply gotten lucky? The experts were divided. The jump he made was incredibly dangerous, perhaps even suicidal. He had jumped at night into a thunderstorm with wind chill temperatures far below freezing, over some of the most rugged terrain in the country. He was wearing a business suit and loafers. The parachute he had chosen was not a steerable model. The odds of survival were astronomically low. Most investigators believed he had likely perished in the attempt. His body lost forever to the wilderness. And yet, there was no proof. In the absence of a body, the legend grew. He became a folk hero, a working-class anti-hero who had beaten the system. He was the subject of songs, books, and movies. Dozens of men came forward over the years claiming to be D.B. Cooper. All were eventually dismissed. The FBI investigated over 1,000 serious suspects and cleared every single one. The man in the business suit remained a ghost. For 9 years, the case was a perfect, sealed mystery. Then, in February 1980, the story took a stunning turn. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family vacation digging a fire pit on the sandy banks of the Columbia River at a place called Tenabar. His fingers brushed against something in the sand. He pulled it out. It was a bundle of rotting, disintegrated paper. When his family looked closer, they realized what it was: 3 packets of $20 bills. The money was water-damaged and bound with rubber bands. The FBI was called. They confirmed the serial numbers. It was Cooper's money. A total of $5,800 had been recovered. But this discovery, the only piece of concrete evidence ever found from the jump, only deepened the mystery. Tenabar was miles downstream and far to the west of the FBI's most likely jump zone. How did the money get there? Did it float down the river from where Cooper landed? Or did it mean he had landed much closer to the river than anyone had ever imagined? Geologists and hydrologists studied the river's currents and the money's state of decay. Their findings suggested the money had likely washed ashore years after the hijacking, but they could not definitively trace its path. The discovery was a tantalizing clue that led nowhere. It was an echo from the void, a confirmation that the event had happened, but no explanation of how it had ended. In 2011, on the 40th anniversary of the crime, the FBI released new information. An analysis of Cooper's tie left behind on the plane had revealed particles of rare earth elements, specifically pure, unalloyed titanium. This suggested he may have worked in the aerospace industry or a chemical plant, perhaps as a manager or engineer, a man familiar with advanced materials and manufacturing processes. It was another piece of the puzzle, but the puzzle itself remained impossibly vast. Finally, in July 2016, after 45 years of dead ends, the FBI officially suspended the active investigation. The D.B. Cooper case, the only unsolved act of air piracy in the history of the United States, was relegated to the cold case files. The Gambit had been a success. Cooper bet his life against a fortune and the anonymity of the wilderness, and whether he won or lost that bet, he achieved his ultimate goal. He disappeared. He stepped out of a plane and into folklore, leaving behind nothing but a name that wasn't his, a handful of degraded bills on a riverbank, and a perfect, enduring mystery. Cooper's crime, while audacious, was ultimately one of personal gain. It was a heist, not a holy war. But the sky has also been a stage for acts of terror where the stakes are far greater than money, where the goal is not escape but confrontation, and where the theater of violence is not a remote wilderness but the world's stage. Our next case takes us from the cold anonymity of the skies to the sun-drenched waters of the Mediterranean, where a luxury cruise ship became a floating prison and the world watched as a deadly game of political blackmail unfolded. Case 3, the Achille Lauro hijacking. The act of air piracy, as demonstrated by the enigmatic D.B. Cooper, can be a crime of cold, calculated avarice. A personal gambit for fortune and escape. But the sky, and by extension the sea, those vast, isolating territories beyond the immediate reach of law, can also become stages for a different kind of performance. A theater of political terror where the script is written in the ink of ideology and punctuated by acts of shocking brutality. The goal is not personal enrichment, but global attention. The currency is not cash, but fear. In October of 1985, less than 4 months after the ordeal of TWA Flight 847 concluded in Beirut, the world's attention shifted from the airways to the waterways. The vessel was the MS Achille Lauro, an elegant, if aging, Italian cruise liner navigating the sun-drenched turquoise of the Mediterranean. It was a floating symbol of Western leisure, a sanctuary for those in their golden years seeking gentle adventure and scenic repose. Its decks, which should have echoed with laughter and the clinking of glasses, would soon resonate with the metallic click of Kalashnikovs and the hushed prayers of the terrified. The cruise had begun in Genoa, Italy, a grand voyage through history. On October 7th, the Achille Lauro docked in Alexandria, Egypt. The majority of its passengers, over 600 of them, disembarked for a 2-day overland excursion to see the wonders of Cairo and the Giza pyramids. They were scheduled to rejoin the ship later in Port Said. On board, a skeleton contingent of 97 passengers and several hundred crew members remained as the ship set a course for the mouth of the Suez Canal. It was a quiet, transitional leg of the journey. The ship felt spacious, almost empty. The atmosphere was one of profound peace. Among the passengers who remained were Leon Klinghoffer, a 69-year-old retired appliance manufacturer from New York, and his wife of 36 years, Marilyn. Their voyage was meant to be a celebration of their wedding anniversary. It was a trip they had almost canceled. Leon had suffered 2 strokes that had left him partially paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. But Marilyn had insisted. She was his devoted caretaker, his constant companion, his advocate. She wanted him to see the world, to feel the sun on his face. Their presence on the ship was a testament to love's defiance of physical limitation. This tranquil scene was a facade waiting to be shattered. Also on board were 4 men who had boarded in Genoa. They were not tourists. They were members of the Palestine Liberation Front, or PLF, a radical faction of the larger Palestine Liberation Organization. Their leader, the man who had planned their mission from a distant shore, was Mohammed Zayden, better known as Abu Abbas. The 4 men Youssef Majid al-Malki, Bassam al-Asker, Ahmad Maruf al-Asadi, and Abdulatif Ibrahim Fatayr were young, volatile, and heavily armed. They carried Soviet-made machine guns and grenades concealed in their luggage. Their original plan was not to hijack the Achille Lauro. It was far more sinister. They intended to remain clandestine passengers until the ship docked in Ashdod, a major port in Israel. From there, they would launch a suicidal attack on the city, aiming to kill as many Israeli soldiers and civilians as possible. They were a death squad in waiting, but the plan went wrong. The plot unraveled due to a moment of carelessness. On the afternoon of October 7th, a cabin steward, delivering fruit to the hijackers' cabin, walked in on them as they were cleaning their weapons. The element of surprise was lost. The mission was compromised. In that moment of discovery, panic and desperation took over. The meticulously planned terrorist attack improvised itself into a hostage crisis. The 4 men burst from their cabin, their AK-47s held high. They fired shots into the air. The sharp, deafening reports tore through the ship's quiet corridors. They were shouting in Arabic and broken English. The crew and the few passengers scattered on the decks were rounded up at gunpoint. There was confusion, disbelief, and then the slow, sickening dawn of terror. Everyone, elderly tourists in their holiday attire, uniformed crew members, cooks from the galley, was herded into the ship's main dining lounge. The elegant room, designed for fine dining and conversation, became a prison. The doors were sealed. Armed guards stood watch. Captain Gerardo de Rosa, a man of the sea with decades of experience, was summoned to the bridge. A hijacker held a gun to his head and ordered him to change course. He was to sail away from Egypt, north towards Tartus, Syria. Over the ship's radio, Captain de Rosa broadcast the hijackers' demands to the world. They wanted the release of 50 Palestinian militants held in Israeli prisons, including a notorious figure named Samir Kuntar, who had been convicted of a particularly brutal attack on an Israeli family. The Gambit was declared. The Achille Lauro, with its captive audience, was now a floating piece of leverage. For the next 48 hours, the ship was a ghost, adrift in a sea of political uncertainty. They reached the Syrian coast, but the government in Damascus, wary of being drawn into the crisis, refused the ship permission to dock. They turned them away. The Achille Lauro was now a pariah state, a vessel no one wanted. It turned and limped back towards the Egyptian coast, its fuel and water running low, the tension on board stretched to a breaking point. Inside the dining hall, the hostages endured a grim vigil. The hijackers were nervous, unpredictable, and prone to fits of rage. They postured with their weapons, waving grenades and making threats. They separated the passengers by nationality, creating a chilling inventory of potential victims. They paid special attention to those with American and British passports. Among the group of about 20 such hostages, they found an easy target for their venom, the quiet, dignified man in the wheelchair, Leon Klinghoffer. As a Jew and an American, Klinghoffer embodied everything the hijackers professed to hate. They taunted him. They accused him of being an agent of Zionism. His quiet stoicism and Marilyn's fierce protectiveness only seemed to fuel their anger. By the afternoon of October 8th, the hijackers' frustration had boiled over. Their demands were being ignored. The world was not capitulating. They decided they needed to prove their resolve, to add blood to their rhetoric. The leader of the group on board, Youssef al-Malki, announced that they would begin executing hostages, one every hour, starting with an American. The passports were collected again. A random selection was made. The name chosen was an American woman named Mildred Hodes. The hijackers then decided a man would be a better choice. They selected an Austrian-American man named Stanley Kabatsky. But it was Leon Klinghoffer they truly wanted. Malky ordered 2 of the crew members to bring Klinghoffer out of the main dining hall and onto the open deck. Marilyn tried to follow, but she was shoved back, a gun barrel pressed against her. She watched in helpless terror as her husband was wheeled away. On the sun-bleached deck of the Achille Lauro, with the vast, indifferent sea as a backdrop, Leon Klinghoffer faced his executioner. He was positioned at the ship's rail. Malky stood over him. Klinghoffer, unable to stand, looked up from his wheelchair. According to the later confession of the hijacker, Klinghoffer's last act was to turn his head away in a final, silent gesture of defiance. Malky raised his Kalashnikov and fired once into Klinghoffer's forehead and again into his chest. The act was one of supreme cowardice, a murder devoid of any context other than pure, unadulterated hate. But the brutality was not yet complete. Malky then ordered a ship's barber and a waiter, who had been forced to witness the execution, to push Leon Klinghoffer's body, still seated in his wheelchair, over the side of the ship. They hesitated. Malky screamed at them, threatening to kill them too. Weeping, they complied. The body and the chair tipped over the rail and plunged into the Mediterranean, disappearing beneath the waves with a small, quickly erased splash. Back in the dining hall, Marilyn Klinghoffer was frantic with worry. She asked the hijackers where her husband was. One of them looked at her with cold indifference and said, "We moved him to the sickbay." It was a lie designed to maintain order, a casual cruelty layered upon an obscene act of violence. While Klinghoffer's body sank into the depths, a complex diplomatic negotiation was taking place. The PLO, embarrassed by the actions of its rogue faction, was desperate to contain the damage. Yasser Arafat publicly condemned the hijacking. He dispatched Abu Abbas, the mastermind himself, to Egypt to negotiate an end to the standoff. Abbas communicated with the hijackers via radio, brokering a deal with the Egyptian and Italian governments. The terms were simple. The hijackers would surrender to Egyptian authorities in Port Said. In exchange, they would be granted safe passage out of Egypt, flown to freedom in Tunis, the then headquarters of the PLO. Crucially, as part of this negotiation, the hijackers assured Abbas that no one had been harmed. Abbas relayed this information to the Egyptians and Italians. The world, holding its breath, was told that the crisis was on the verge of a peaceful resolution. On October 9th, the Achille Lauro docked at Port Said. The 4 hijackers disembarked, surrendering not to the Italian authorities whose ship it was but to the Egyptians. They were whisked away, treated not as terrorists but as political emissaries. The remaining hostages were freed. As they stepped onto solid ground, a wave of relief swept over them. But it was a relief built on a lie. The truth did not come out immediately. The Egyptian authorities, eager to be rid of the affair, kept the ship and its crew isolated. It was only after the Achille Lauro was allowed to sail out of Egyptian waters into the open sea that Captain de Rosa was finally able to radio the full, horrifying story to the Italian authorities. He told them of the 48 hours of terror, and he told them of the murder of Leon Klinghoffer. When the news reached Washington, D.C., it was met with cold fury. President Ronald Reagan had been assured by Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak that the hijackers would be prosecuted. The news that they were instead being flown to freedom on an Egyptair Boeing 737 was a profound betrayal. The image of a helpless American citizen in a wheelchair, executed and thrown into the sea, was an intolerable outrage. Reagan decided that the United States would not stand by. If international law and diplomacy could not deliver justice, then the U.S. military would. What followed was a daring and unprecedented military operation. U.S. intelligence agencies worked feverishly, tracking the movements of the hijackers and Abu Abbas. They learned the hijackers were being put on a commercial Egyptair flight bound for Tunisia. The Tunisian government, however, under pressure from the U.S., refused the plane landing rights. The flight was diverted, its new destination unknown. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, sailing in the Ionian Sea, the order came down from the president. Intercept the plane. 4 F-14 Tomcat fighter jets, the elite interceptors of the Navy, were launched into the night sky. They were accompanied by an E-2C Hawkeye, an airborne command and control aircraft. Using sophisticated radar and communications intelligence, they began to hunt for the Egyptair 737 in the vast darkness over the Mediterranean. It was like finding a needle in a haystack. For hours, they searched. Finally, they got a lock. the F-14s, flying without lights, closed in on the unsuspecting airliner. The American pilots could see the passengers through the windows. The Egyptian pilot was contacted. In calm, professional, and unyielding tones, the F-14 lead pilot instructed him to follow them. The Egyptian pilot refused. The American pilot's response was simple and chilling. He informed the Egyptian that he was now under their control and would divert to the NATO airbase at Sigonella in Sicily, Italy. If he did not comply, they would shoot him down. The F-14s turned on their lights, revealing their menacing forms, boxing in the airliner. The Egyptian pilot, seeing the missiles on the wings of the warplanes that flanked him, had no choice. He complied. The Egyptair 737, escorted by its powerful captors, landed at Sigonella airbase shortly after midnight. As it rolled to a stop on a remote taxiway, it was immediately surrounded by U.S. Special Forces Delta Force commandos who had been flown in. The American plan was to board the plane, arrest the hijackers and Abu Abbas, and fly them to the United States to face justice. But then, the operation hit an unexpected snag. The airbase was on Italian soil. The Italian government, led by Prime Minister Bettino Craxi, considered the matter to be under their jurisdiction. A convoy of Italian carabinieri, the national military police, arrived and surrounded the American special forces who were surrounding the plane. For several tense hours, two of the world's closest allies stood muzzle to muzzle on a darkened Sicilian tarmac. It was a diplomatic crisis of the highest order, a standoff between American military might and Italian sovereign law. Ultimately, after a heated series of phone calls between Rome and Washington, President Reagan relented. The Italians had jurisdiction. The Delta Force soldiers stood down. The Italian police arrested the 4 hijackers who had been on the Achille Lauro. But the drama was not over. The Italians, in a move that infuriated the United States, refused to detain Abu Abbas. They argued that he was on the plane with an Iraqi diplomatic passport and was not part of the ship's hijacking team, but a negotiator. Despite frantic American protests and a warrant for his arrest, the Italian government allowed Abbas to board another plane and fly to Rome, and from there to Yugoslavia, where he vanished. The mastermind had slipped through their fingers. The 4 hijackers were tried and convicted in Italian courts. Youssef al-Malki, the man who shot Leon Klinghoffer, was given a 30-year sentence. He would later escape from prison briefly before being recaptured. The others received long sentences. Abu Abbas was convicted in absentia. He remained one of the world's most wanted terrorists for nearly 2 decades. His story would not end until 2003, when he was captured by U.S. forces in Baghdad following the invasion of Iraq. He died of natural causes in American custody a year later. Marilyn Klinghoffer, who had to identify her husband's recovered body, returned to New York a widow, a woman broken by grief. She died of cancer just 4 months after the hijacking, never recovering from the loss and the trauma. Her daughters, Lisa and Ilsa, established the Leon and Marilyn Klinghoffer Memorial Foundation, an organization dedicated to combating terrorism through legal and educational means. The hijacking of the Achille Lauro was not a successful gambit for the PLF. It was a public relations disaster that exposed the brutal, nihilistic heart of their ideology. The murder of an invalid was not an act of war, it was an act of savagery. Yet, the story also highlights the complexities of international justice. The daring interception by the U.S. Navy was a stunning success, but the political standoff at Sigonella demonstrated how even the most decisive military action could become ensnared in the web of law and national pride. It was a messy, complicated affair that left a lingering sense of incomplete justice. Sometimes, however, the line between right and wrong, between action and inaction, is drawn with terrifying clarity. Sometimes, a government, faced with an impossibly distant and dangerous hostage crisis, decides that negotiation is not an option. Our next case takes us back to the skies, to a hijacked airliner flown across a continent, where 106 hostages were held under the protection of a ruthless dictator. It is the story of a rescue mission so audacious, so daring, it has become the stuff of legend. The story of Entebbe. Case 4, the Entebbe hostage crisis. The messy, unsatisfying conclusion of the Achille Lauro affair on the tarmac at Sigonella was a stark lesson in the limits of international cooperation. It demonstrated how justice, even when within grasp, can be subverted by politics and national pride. The world, it seemed, was a place where terrorists could murder an unarmed man and still be afforded the courtesies of diplomatic passage. But this was not a universally accepted truth. There are moments in history when a nation, pushed to the brink, decides that the rules of engagement must be rewritten. When diplomacy fails and pleas go unanswered, the only remaining option is the one of least resort: audacious, overwhelming force. This is the story of such a moment. It is the story of a hijacking that crossed a continent, a dictator who became a jailer, and a rescue mission so daring, so improbable, that it remains the benchmark by which all other counter-terrorist operations are judged. Our story begins on June 27, 1976. Air France Flight 139, an Airbus A300, sat on the tarmac at Athens Ellinikon International Airport. It was a brief stopover on its route from Tel Aviv to Paris. New passengers boarded, joining those who had begun their journey in Israel. The atmosphere was unremarkable. The plane was a cross-section of the world, families returning from vacation, business travelers, students, a group of Holocaust survivors. The crew, led by the veteran Captain Michel Bacos, prepared for the final leg of the flight. The doors were secured, and at 12:30 p.m. the aircraft lifted off into the Greek sky. Just 8 minutes into the flight, the routine was shattered. 4 individuals rose from their seats. 2 were Palestinians, members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine External Operations PFLPO. The other 2 were German nationals, Wilfried Bose and Brigitte Kohlmann, members of the German radical leftist group, the Revolutionary Cells. They were a new, terrifying hybrid of international terrorism, a union of Palestinian nationalism and European anti-Zionist, anti-capitalist ideology. They brandished pistols and a grenade. One of them, a woman, announced the hijacking over the intercom, her voice laced with revolutionary fervor, first in heavily accented English, then in German. Panic rippled through the cabin. The hijackers forced their way into the cockpit. They knew exactly what they were doing. Wilfried Bose, the German leader, took control, ordering Captain Bacos to divert the plane. The new destination was Benghazi, Libya, a state then ruled by the erratic and anti-Western dictator Muammar Gaddafi. For 7 agonizing hours, Flight 139 sat on the scorching tarmac in Benghazi. The air conditioning failed. The heat inside the cabin became suffocating. The hijackers were tense, their weapons a constant presence. It was here that they made their first grim selection. A British-born Israeli citizen, Patricia Martel, who had feigned a miscarriage, was released. It was a small act of mercy in a sea of menace. But her debriefing later by British intelligence would provide the first crucial details about the hijackers and their organization. After refueling, the plane took off again, plunging deeper into the African night. The hostages had no idea where they were going. The pilots, flying under duress, were simply following orders, their compass pointing south into the heart of the continent. In the early morning hours of June 28th, the plane finally began its descent. Through the windows, the hostages could see the shimmering expanse of a great lake. They were landing at Entebbe International Airport in Uganda. As the plane taxied to a halt, the hostages saw a chilling sight. Ugandan soldiers, armed and in uniform, were surrounding the aircraft. This was not a rescue. It was a reception. The dictator of Uganda, the flamboyant and brutal Idi Amin Dada, was not a neutral party. He was an accomplice. He strode onto the plane, a massive, imposing figure in his field marshal's uniform, adorned with medals. He presented himself not as a jailer, but as a savior, a statesman who would negotiate on their behalf. It was a grotesque piece of theater. The hostages were not guests. They were prisoners of the state. They were moved from the cramped confines of the aircraft to the airport's old, abandoned terminal building. The conditions were squalid. The building was decaying, dirty, and there were not enough mattresses or toilets for the 248 passengers and 12 crew members. Armed Ugandan soldiers stood guard alongside the hijackers, their roles indistinguishable. The next day, June 29th, the hijackers made their demands known. They demanded the release of 53 pro-Palestinian militants. 40 were held in Israeli prisons. The others were scattered in jails across Kenya, France, Switzerland, and West Germany. Their deadline was 2 p.m. on July 1st. If the demands were not met, they would begin executing the hostages. It was on this day that the most sinister and chilling chapter of the ordeal began. The hijackers, with the active cooperation of the Ugandan guards, carried out a selection. It was a word that struck ice-cold terror into the hearts of the Israeli passengers. It was the same term the Nazis had used in the death camps to separate those who would live from those who would die. The hostages were ordered to present their passports. Wilfried Bose and Brigitte Coleman, two Germans, stood at the entrance to a separate room directing the separation. Those with Israeli passports and those with Jewish-sounding names were herded into an adjoining room. The non-Jewish passengers were moved to a separate area. The historical echo was deafening, sickening. A German man, a survivor of the concentration camps, showed Bose the camp registration number tattooed on his arm. "I am a survivor," he said. Bose, a revolutionary who saw himself as an anti-fascist, reportedly replied, "I'm no Nazi. I am an idealist." The twisted irony was lost on him. He was a German, separating Jews from non-Jews at gunpoint, perpetuating the very terror he claimed to oppose. On June 30th, the hijackers released a large group of the non-Israeli hostages. They were put on a plane and flown to Paris. It was a calculated move, designed to increase pressure on the Israeli government, to isolate them, to leave them with the stark choice of capitulating or condemning their own citizens to death. But this act also contained the seeds of the hijackers' undoing. In a remarkable act of courage and solidarity, Captain Bakos refused to leave. He informed the hijackers that all the passengers were his responsibility, and he would not abandon them. His entire crew, all 12 of them, volunteered to stay with him. Their decision was a profound statement of human decency in the face of terror. Their fate was now tied to that of the remaining 106 Israeli and Jewish hostages. In Jerusalem, the Israeli government was in crisis. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and his cabinet were facing an impossible dilemma. Israel had a long-standing, ironclad policy: never negotiate with terrorists. To do so, they believed, would only invite more terror. But now over 100 of their citizens were 2,500 miles from home, held captive by a coalition of terrorists and a sovereign, hostile government. A military option seemed like pure fantasy. Entebbe was deep within Africa, far beyond the normal operational range of the Israeli Defense Forces (IDF. The risks were astronomical. The cabinet was divided. Rabin, a pragmatist and former general, was deeply skeptical of a military solution and leaned towards negotiation to save lives. Defense Minister Shimon Peres was the hawk. He argued fiercely that any capitulation would be a fatal blow to Israel's credibility and long-term security. He pushed the IDF to find a way, anyway, to make a rescue mission possible. The clock was ticking. The Israeli government announced publicly that they were willing to negotiate, a move designed to buy time. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a plan of almost unbelievable audacity was beginning to take shape. It was codenamed Operation Thunderbolt. The Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, went into overdrive. They gathered information from the newly released hostages in Paris. These debriefings provided priceless intelligence about the layout of the old terminal, the number of hijackers, their weapons, their habits, and the disposition of the Ugandan guards. A second, almost miraculous piece of luck emerged. The old terminal building at Entebbe had been constructed years earlier by a large Israeli construction company. The company still had the blueprints. The IDF now knew the building's layout in intimate, exhaustive detail. A team of elite commandos from Sayeret Matkal, Israel's premier special forces unit, began to train. On a remote military base, they built a full-scale mock-up of the Entebbe terminal. They rehearsed the assault again and again, refining every movement, timing every action down to the second. The plan they devised was as creative as it was dangerous. They would fly 4 C-130 Hercules transport planes undetected across Africa. They would fly low under the radar of hostile nations like Egypt, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia. The first plane would carry the assault team and a black Mercedes-Benz limousine, an exact replica of the one used by Idi Amin. The idea was to land, drive the presidential convoy directly to the terminal, and achieve complete surprise, tricking the Ugandan guards into thinking Amin himself was arriving for an unscheduled visit. The other 3 planes would carry reinforcements, medical teams, and armored vehicles to secure the perimeter and hold off the Ugandan army. The mission was led by Brigadier General Dan Shamran on the ground. The commander of the Seret Makal assault unit was Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Yoni Netanyahu, the older brother of the future Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Yoni was a charismatic, almost legendary figure in the IDF, a brilliant and courageous officer. The risks were immense. A single navigation error, a detection by enemy radar, a mechanical failure, any of these could doom the mission and everyone involved. Even if they made it to Entebbe, there was no guarantee of success. A prolonged firefight could turn the terminal into a slaughterhouse. And there was no easy way out. They would have to refuel in a friendly country for the return journey. The plan depended on a refueling stop in Nairobi, Kenya, a secret agreement secured through delicate diplomacy. On July 3rd, with the deadline just hours away, the Israeli cabinet met for a final, fateful vote. The IDF presented its plan. Rabin, still deeply worried, was swayed by the meticulous planning and the confidence of his commanders. The vote was unanimous. Operation Thunderbolt was a go. That afternoon, the 4 Hercules planes took off from Sharm el-Sheikh in the Sinai Peninsula and turned south, flying into the setting sun. For 8 hours, they flew in near-total radio silence. Inside the dark, cavernous holds of the aircraft, 200 commandos sat, checking their weapons, their faces grim with concentration. They were a modern-day raiding party, flying across a continent on a mission that defied all military logic. Just before midnight, local time, they began their descent into Entebbe. They came in low and fast, their flight path mimicking that of a scheduled British cargo plane to avoid suspicion from air traffic control. The wheels of the first C-130 touched down on the runway. The cargo bay door opened before the plane had even come to a full stop. Down the ramp rolled the black Mercedes, followed by 2 Land Rovers filled with commandos in Ugandan army uniforms. The Trojan horse had arrived. They drove at speed toward the old terminal. But the plan for total surprise hit an immediate snag. 2 Ugandan sentries, not expecting any motorcade, ordered the convoy to halt. The commandos had a choice: try to bluff their way through or open fire. Yoni Netanyahu, in the lead Land Rover, made the instant decision. They could not risk the sentries raising the alarm. The commandos opened fire with silenced pistols. The sentries fell. But one of them had a rifle, and he managed to fire a few rounds before he died. The element of surprise, while not completely lost, was now compromised. Netanyahu's voice crackled over the radio. "Go! Go! Go!" The convoy accelerated, screeching to a halt in front of the terminal building. The commandos leaped from the vehicles and stormed the main entrance. They used megaphones, shouting in Hebrew and English, "Get down! Stay down. We are Israeli soldiers." Inside, the hostages, who had been trying to sleep on the filthy floor, were thrown from weary despair into a maelstrom of terror and confusion. The air was filled with shouting and the terrifying explosions of gunfire. The commandos moved with a lethal, practiced efficiency. The first team burst into the main hall where the hostages were kept. Within seconds, they had identified and shot dead the 2 German hijackers, Bose and Coleman, and their 2 Palestinian accomplices who were in the room. 2 other hijackers who were in a separate area were also quickly neutralized. The firefight inside the terminal was over in less than 3 minutes. But the danger was far from over. Ugandan soldiers, alerted by the gunfire, began firing at the terminal from the control tower and other positions. A second team of Israeli commandos engaged them, laying down suppressing fire. A third team fanned out across the airfield, placing explosive charges on the squadron of 11 Ugandan MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighter jets parked on the tarmac, ensuring that no pursuit could be mounted. As the hostages were being hustled out of the terminal and towards the waiting C-130s, tragedy struck. A sniper in the control tower opened fire. A single bullet hit Yonatan Netanyahu in the chest as he directed the evacuation. He collapsed, mortally wounded. He would die in the arms of his comrades on the flight out of Uganda. 3 hostages were also killed in the crossfire, caught in the chaotic exchange of bullets. A 4th hostage, 74-year-old Dora Block, had been taken to a hospital in Kampala earlier in the week after choking on a piece of food. She was not in the terminal during the raid. When news of the successful Israeli rescue reached an enraged and humiliated Idi Amin, he ordered his secret police to go to her hospital room. She was dragged from her bed and murdered, her body dumped in a nearby forest. The entire ground operation at Entebbe, from touchdown to takeoff, lasted just 53 minutes. As the last Hercules lifted off the runway, leaving behind a scene of smoldering wreckage and chaos, it climbed into the night sky carrying 102 rescued hostages. They were flying home. The plane landed first in Nairobi to refuel, where Yoni Netanyahu was pronounced dead, and the wounded were treated. Then they began the final leg of their journey back to Israel. They landed at Ben Gurion Airport to a scene of national euphoria. The country, which had been paralyzed with fear, erupted in celebration. Families were reunited in tearful embraces. The returning commandos were hailed as heroes, but the celebration was tinged with sorrow. The nation mourned the loss of its fallen commander, Yoni Netanyahu, the mission's only military casualty. His death transformed him into a national icon, a symbol of sacrifice and courage. The Entebbe raid was a stunning military success and a profound political statement. It sent an unequivocal message to the world. Israel would not abandon its citizens, no matter where they were, no matter how impossible the odds. The Hijackers' Gambit, which had seemed so certain to succeed under the protection of a sovereign state, had been met with a counter-gambit of such breathtaking audacity that it changed the calculus of terrorism forever. It was a victory, but a costly one, paid for with the lives of a brave soldier and 4 innocent civilians. It was a stark reminder that even in the most triumphant of rescues, the specter of death is never far away.